Good morning, everyone. So it is my honor to introduce the speakers for our final panel today. First of all, I'm happy to introduce Rabbi Shmuel Silber, who is the founder and dean of the Institute for Jewish Continuity and also serves as rabbi of Suburban Orthodox Congregation Torres Chaim in Baltimore, Maryland. Prior to coming to Suburban Orthodox, Rabbi Silber was the assistant rabbi of Congregation Shomrei Torah in Fair Lawn, New Jersey. Rabbi Silver received Samika, or ordination, from Yeshiva University. In addition, he has received a master's degree in secondary Jewish education from Israeli Graduate School. Rabbi Silber has served as a scholar in residence in Israel and South Africa, taught a master's degree program in adult education through the Johns Hopkins University, and teaches an ongoing class at Tehillim at the Women's Institute of Torah here in Baltimore. Our second panelist is Dr. Boyer G. Freeman, who is senior pastor of New St. Mark Baptist Church, located in Baltimore, Maryland. Licensed to the gospel ministry by the church of his youth, Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church in Glendale, Ohio, Dr. Freeman relocated to the Baltimore, Washington area in 1985. He was ordained as an associate minister of the First Baptist Church of Guilford in Columbia, Maryland in 1995. Dr. Freeman is a social justice minister grounded in the biblical writ. At age 29, he was elected the youngest president of an NAACP branch in the state of Maryland in Howard County. He has served as vice chairman and chairman of NAACP Region 7, which is Maryland, DC, and Virginia. He's a proponent of faithful stewardship and has served as treasurer of the United Baptist Missionary Convention and Auxiliaries of Maryland from 2000 to May 2006. A gifted preacher, Dr. Freeman has been blessed to preach the gospel on the continents of North America, Asia, Africa, and in the Caribbean. And so thank you again, Rabbi Silber and Pastor Freeman, for joining us. And Rabbi Silber, if you would like to open with your presentation.
Okay, good morning, everyone. It's an incredible privilege to be here, Pastor Freeman, an incredible privilege to be on this panel together with you and Aliyah and Anita and everyone who worked so hard to put this program together. It's really incredibly special. So I've been asked to address the tension between individual autonomy and the public good when interpreting one's obligations as regards accepting or declining scientific recommendations such as vaccines. So this discussion, or this question about, or I should say the tension between individual autonomy and public good, I'd like to kind of take a step back and frame my comments this morning in two different parts. The notion of individual autonomy versus public good, and then the clash, or not clash, I should say, but sometimes the tension between religious beliefs and medicine. But before I get into both of those parts, just one word of introduction. You know, the Bible, I guess for you, what you would call the Old Testament, for us, what we call the Torah, brings down an interesting idea in Exodus. And the Torah relates that when you go ahead and you damage someone, there are multiple different categories of damages that you have to pay. If I hurt someone and they can't go to work, I have to pay for their lost wages, I have to pay for their medical bills. And the Talmud seizes on this idea of v'rapo yirapeh, to pay for their medical bills. And the Talmud explains an incredible statement. The Talmud writes, from here you learn mikan shenitan rishus l'rofe l'rapos. From here we learn that a doctor has the right to administer medicinal healing. And this is an incredibly important theological statement, because without this understanding of the Talmud, our perspective would be as follows. God visits sickness upon an individual. And if it's the will of God to visit sickness upon the individual, then what right do we as people have to intervene in the divine master plan? So therefore, again, there's a verse in the Torah that tells us, no, the fact, and it's an interesting idea, the fact that I have to pay someone's medical bills, by definition, tells me that it is permitted, and not only permitted, but encouraged to seek out medical treatment. So this idea, but yet we do find this tension between the will of God and yet again, medical directives or medical science. It goes even a little bit further, because the truth is, even when God creates the first man, Adam, God gives Adam a number of different obligations. So we're all familiar, of course, with the most famous one, the one that he was not able to adhere to for too long: don't eat from the tree of the forbidden fruit. But before that, he gives Adam an obligation to procreation, and also vikivshua, to go ahead and subdue the world, literally to conquer or to dominate the world. And the way the rabbis of the Talmud understand that concept is that man is charged with unlocking the secrets of the universe. And part of those secrets of the universe is medicine, understanding science, understanding what causes illness and how do we treat it. So it's really, from a Judaic perspective, an incredible journey. From on one hand, before we see the verse in the Bible, I would think that he who visits sickness upon man should be the one who removes sickness from man. And I, as an individual, have no right to interfere in the divine plan. The verse then tells us that is not true. V'rapo yirapeh. If I have to pay medical bills, it means that doctors have the right to treat patients. And if doctors have the right to treat patients, then ultimately, again, I have an obligation to seek out medicinal healing. And at least from a Judaic perspective, this is incredibly important. Do I believe that God is responsible for everything? And therefore, God brings illness, God brings cancer, God brings COVID-19? Absolutely. But the same God who brings these illnesses, these pandemics, is the same God who gives man the ability to understand the science, to create a vaccine, to create remedies. And therefore, again, my theological mandate is therefore to go ahead and participate in that scientific process, to participate in these curative effects as well. That's kind of just by way of introduction in terms of how Judaism understands the role of medicine together with the divine will. Now, this notion of individual autonomy versus public good is a fascinating discussion. In Judaism, the simple answer to that is, from a Judaic perspective, and again, I want to be clear for the sake of intellectual honesty and transparency, when I say the Judaic perspective, there are many different perspectives in Judaism. There are as many perspectives as there are Jews. So when I say the perspective, I'm giving you the perspective, I guess what I would call conventional Orthodox thought, but I'm sure if you were to invite clergy from the other streams of Judaism, they would perhaps share different ideas. So I just want to be clear, I'm not the ambassador for the Jewish people. I'm not even the ambassador for myself. I don't do a good enough job with that. I'm conveying to you one man's thoughts that I think represent a stream of thought within Judaism. When there is a tension between the needs of the many and the needs of the individual, the needs of the many always win out. That is a pillar principle in Judaism, the preservation of the community, the preservation of the covenantal community, and the preservation of the greater community always supersedes the needs of the individual. And that's said understanding that therefore the individual will be put at a disadvantage. From a Judaic perspective, this has to do also with the continuity of the collective. The collective must always go on. The collective must always grow forward. And if that means, God forbid, sacrificing the needs of the individual for the benefit of the collective, then ultimately, again, that is what is done. Now, obviously, I'm painting this in broad strokes. There are nuances and there are exceptions to this idea, but on a general panoramic level, that's the perspective of Judaism. Now, one thing that I think kind of puts Judaic thought in a little bit of a different place, and I don't know what we'll hear from Pastor Freeman in terms of other religions, but in terms of at least Western society, is Judaism does not really have the concept of rights. What do I mean by that? We have 613 what we call mitzvos, obligations in our Torah. Judaism preaches the concept of responsibilities rather than rights. So from a Judaic perspective, I don't have a right to anything. Nothing's owed to me. There are no entitlements that are coming. I don't have rights. I have responsibilities. What do those responsibilities mean? I have a responsibility to be a moral individual. So my morality is defined by the Bible, by God. I have an obligation to be an ethical individual. I have an obligation to refrain from stealing. I have an obligation to refrain from immorality. These are my responsibilities. Now, of course, if I exercise my responsibilities and you exercise your responsibilities, then by definition, again, we create a society that benefits every single individual. But the notion of the discussion of rights, which again is an incredible idea, is a little bit foreign to the Judaic lexicon. we focus much more not on what I am entitled to, but instead what my obligation is. And those obligations play themselves out in three ways. There are obligations I have towards my God, there are obligations that I have towards my fellow man, and there are obligations that I have towards myself. So for example, we're obviously here in this morning focusing on the concept of vaccines. So whether it's vaccines or mask wearing or anything else, the discussion in a certain degree is kind of simple, meaning I have an obligation, I have a responsibility to ensure that I don't harm you. That's my responsibility. I have to make sure that, now again, we also say in the positive, I have an obligation to help you. I have an obligation to be charitable. I have an obligation to be giving. But I have an obligation to make sure that I don't harm you in any way. That is my responsibility as given to me by God. And so whatever I can do to ensure that I don't visit harm upon another person, by definition becomes a Judaic responsibility. So God willing, there should be a vaccine that is proven effective and it should be available. I would venture to say that from a Jewish perspective, there would definitely be an obligation to take that vaccine because, again, I have an obligation to go ahead and safeguard you from harm. And if I don't do my part in safeguarding my own health, same idea with wearing a mask. So again, if by wearing a mask, I can go ahead and safeguard you from some type of danger, then I certainly have an obligation to be able to do that. Not because I have rights per se, but because I have responsibilities, a very different kind of lexicon that we operate with. Not a focus on what I am entitled to, not a focus on what my rights are, but a focus on what my responsibilities are to my God, to my community, and to myself. Now, with this kind of conflict that comes up between religious beliefs and clash of medicine. So this does come up. I remember back to our first conference of this group, our first conference, we spoke about end of life issues. So at least from a Jewish Orthodox perspective, there are very often clashes, or I should say conflict, that occurs between in the world of medicine and the world of at least Orthodox Judaism with end of life issues on a simple level. So whereas I would think that most hospitals accept the Harvard criteria for end of life, brain death, many in the Jewish Orthodox community do not accept that definition of end of life and go with cardiac death, which of course could definitely create some level of tension with end of life decisions. So I have every right to make my decisions based on my beliefs, as long as they do not negatively impact the other. So this is incredibly important because I think often we see that everyone should have the right to make their decisions. That's 100%. But I also have to weigh my ability, whether it's for my religious freedoms or my personal freedoms, about how they impact the other. So at least from a religious perspective, if I decide and I tell my family, you know what, I don't want you to think that I'm dead until I stop breathing, until my heart stops pumping, I'm alive. Then I have a right to tell that to my family, to convey that to my family. And they, of course, hopefully will advocate for me in the hospital as well. But when it comes to the exercising of religious beliefs in a way that potentially negatively impact another, and of course, this idea of negatively impacting another could certainly be a little bit subjective, that's where I have to be a little bit more careful. So in this clash between religious beliefs and medicine, what I would say is when you want to exercise your beliefs and really the only person those beliefs impact is you, then absolutely stay strong. But when those impacts have potential negative effect on greater society around you, that's when I believe a person has to find a little bit more of a measured approach. So again, certainly even within the Jewish community, there are different opinions regarding vaccinations in general, whereas I would say the overwhelming majority of the Jewish community is, I'll call, pro-vaccine, whichever vaccines those may be. There's definitely an element within the Jewish community that does not trust vaccinations for a variety of different reasons, either because they're scared about some of the side effects, or some of them may be even motivated by certain more, I'll call it, purist ideological ideas. But that is a stream, but I would say just in a general brushstroke, kind of in a panoramic view, when my views affect me, I have absolutely every ability to hold steadfast to them. The moment there is a negative potential societal impact, that's when I have to begin to think about how to operate with my views as part of greater society. Responsibilities I have are to make sure, again, that I am good with God, I am good with myself, and I am good with my fellow man. See, even when it comes to vaccinations, or for that matter, any medical science, I have to think about, again, not as much what my rights are, but what my responsibilities are to the greater community around me. That's all I have to share for now, and I'll hand it over to Dr. Freeman.